Okay, well, welcome to the December 2015 Central Texas PowerShell User Group meeting. Tonight I'm going to be presenting on DRY, which is Don't Repeat Yourself, Create Dynamic Reusable Tools in PowerShell with Advanced Functions. And for those of you who don't know me, I go by Mike F. Robbins, and MikeFRobbins.com is my website, my blog. But I'm a Microsoft MVP on Windows PowerShell. I'm a Sapien Technologies MVP, leader and co-founder of the Mississippi PowerShell User Group, co-author of Windows PowerShell TFM 4th edition, author of Chapter 6 in the PowerShell Deep Dives book, and winner of the Advanced category in the 2013 Scripting Games. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we're going to cover tonight. We're really going to be talking about writing code that's reusable so that it's not static, it's dynamic. And I'll be showing you how to make your code more readable, how to name your functions properly, how to parameterize your functions, also commandlet binding, which is what turns a normal function into an advanced function, parameter validation. And what parameter validation is you don't want to run a script or a function and not have the valid information that you need for it to complete successfully. You want to try to validate the input that a user is providing early on and fail immediately, because you don't want to make changes to a system when it's not possible to complete the full process. And verbose output, and I'll show all these: pipeline input, error handling, comment-based help, and support should process. So it's time to start the demo. I have like 2 more slides at the very end. I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint, but I at least like to have a few slides to just give a brief description of what we're going to cover. Okay. So just to show you the demo environment we'll be using, and I know this will be really small on the screen, but we'll be using 3 VMs. There's a domain controller running server 2012 R2 that's running server core with no graphical user interface. There's a SQL server that's running Windows 2008 non-R2, and it's running a version of SQL Server, and then a PC that's running Windows 8.1 with power. Everything's got, well, actually the domain controller and PC have PowerShell version 4, because I find that most people aren't running the production preview of 5 or even Windows 10. And really, I'm a server guy, so I do have Windows 10 on my machine, but, and I say I'm a server guy, I'm really an infrastructure guy. I do switches, storage area networks, servers. I'm the Exchange guy, I'm the Active Directory guy, I'm the SQL guy, and so on. So really what I'm focusing on is the server side, although what I'm doing is also applicable to the desktops. Okay, so I'll show you my SQL Server. There's a reason I chose Windows Server 2008 non-R2, because it's the newest operating system that you can get that does not have PowerShell enabled by default. And I know this is really small. When we get to the VM that I'm actually using, it's not going to be this small. So you can see I can't even run PowerShell, and PowerShell, the PowerShell 1.0 bits are on the hard drive, but it's not enabled. So there's no PowerShell on the SQL 03 server. And we are not going to install PowerShell on it either. I'm not going to put you guys through that. So most of our work will be done from a desktop. You know, and even if you're going to use a GUI, a lot of guys, they say, hey, I don't want to use PowerShell, I want to use the GUI. Well, if they want to do that and they can be productive, then that's fine, but manage servers from your desktop. Don't RDP into the server. And really, you shouldn't even have a graphical user interface on the server unless it's something that requires it, like Exchange or a SharePoint web front end or something like that. I've got a lot of comments in this script, and what I'm going to do, I posted a blog article today. I'm going to take all the scripts when we're done tonight, and I'm actually going to put a link on that same blog article where you can download these scripts. So the comments here, they're for me and for you. They're for me to remember to tell you all this stuff, but also when you download this, that you can put all these commands in context. Now, I've actually increased the font to 175%. Let me know if in the back of the room if this is not large enough. It looks like we've got some more room on the screen at least, that I can make it say 200 or whatever. Okay, so I've already run these little prerequisites that I have here, and I'm just going to run invoke command. Now on the PC that I'm using, PowerShell remoting has been enabled. So of course it's going to fail on the SQL Server because there's no PowerShell there, but you can see that we have PowerShell version 4 on the domain controller and on the PC. And I tell you what, I'll go ahead and bump the font up to 200. And if it's too big in the room, then let me know. But I normally write my code really narrow, so a lot of projectors don't project in widescreen, but I'm finding more and more that do. So, you know, should you create a script or a function? And what I do, whenever possible, I write a function because to me it's more tool oriented. But what I do, I write functions that don't actually contain like server names and stuff like that, like proprietary data. I make those parameters mandatory, and then because what I do is I get to share all the code that I write generically on GitHub. I get to get paid to give away code that I write. Well, then I'll write a script to call the function that has the proprietary data in it, and I don't share that script. So it's a way that I can help the community. Okay, so you know, one of the reasons I write functions is I compile them into a script module, because that script module I can simply call the function and it'll auto load it with PowerShell version 3 or higher. Also with PowerShell get, which is, you can use, it's a feature in PowerShell version 5, but I believe it's been backported to some previous versions of PowerShell. You can have a NuGet repository, and you can share your modules. So Microsoft, of course, has the PowerShell gallery where there's public modules, but you can spin up an internal NuGet repository and share your modules between coworkers, and when you push up a new version, all they have to say is update module and they get the updated code. So I'm not going to read through all this. You can read through it if you want to. So when you're naming a function, you want to make sure you use an approved name. And if you don't, when you put it into a module, you're going to get a warning. But what I'm going to do here is, how do you find out? Usually from beginners I hear, how do I find out what the commands are? Well, we're not at that level with this session, but when I'm writing a function, how do I find out what the approved verbs are? So it's very similar. But you can simply use the get verb command, and it'll give you a list of the approved verbs. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to sort these by verb. I'm going to output it to outgrid view. And luckily, now in outgrid view, if this is PowerShell version 5, I can do Control plus and I can actually zoom in. Well, since this is 4, I can't do that, but I just happen to have zoom it on this machine. So I can use, these are all the verbs here. So all you have to do is go down the list and use one of these verbs and you're good to go. Use the one that matches, that closely matches what you're trying to accomplish. So an example is this PS version table command. It actually returns a hash table, and the only part of it I want to return is the PowerShell version. So you can see it's version 4. The simplest function in the world is just to wrap a command inside a function. So I'll actually load this function into memory, and then I'll call the function. So it returns the same thing. Well, the problem is if I call a function, even though it's a valid name, get version, and there's not a command by that name by default, chances are that somebody else is going to name their command the same thing. So it's always a good idea to name your commands kind of like get AD user. It's got an AD prefix for Active Directory. So I would recommend the same thing to prevent name collisions. So you could name it like get PS version for get PowerShell version. And it's the same thing I just did. Well, there's a pretty good chance that maybe someday the PowerShell team will use that command, so that's not really a good idea either. So what I do, since my initials are MR like Mr. for Mike Robbins, all the commands and modules and all that stuff that I develop, I call them like get Mr. PS version or get Mr. user. So I use those abbreviations, and what I would say is discuss this between people at your organization who sets the standards, and pick a standard and stick to it. So if I load that command, it's the same thing I was doing, it's just got a different name. Now what I do want to show you is when you load a function into memory, if I run get PS drive, you'll see I've got a function PS drive. So I want to see all the functions that I just loaded into memory that were started with get and ended in version. So I can see them here. You can also see that they're not part of a module. So once you load those functions into memory, short of closing your PowerShell session and reopening it, the only way to get rid of them out of memory is to delete them. And to delete something, we have remove item as the commandlet. So we'll run this, and I really like writing my commands this way. I like to get something and verify that I can see that I've got 3 results. So then I can pipe that same command to remove item and remove them instead of blindly removing something. It's kind of like, it reminds me of writing SQL, that I'll write something and I'll do a select and I'll see what my results are, and then I'll actually use that same command and I'll do an update or a delete to make sure that I know what data I'm updating, and then I'll run the select again after I do the update or delete. So I'll run this. I just deleted those functions. Now if I run directory get child item on the function drive, I can see that those functions no longer exist. There's a help topic called about functions. And one thing that a lot of people don't realize, you can see I have this commented out to make sure I didn't run it by mistake. I am going to run this, but even if you have a command that you've commented out, you can actually select that command and still run it. And one of the reasons I like the show window option is I can also zoom in here and I can search. So if I wanted to search for something specific, like commandlet. The other thing is, since I have multiple monitors, I can undock this and drag it to an alternate monitor, and I can still run my commands while I'm taking a look at the help. And that's pretty basic. This session's not going to be about help except for providing help in your custom written functions. So one thing with when you're writing functions, when you're writing scripts, when you're writing anything, don't statically assign your values, because I can't tell you how many times that I've seen people that they'll write code to do something for one server, and then they'll basically copy and paste it into a new script and they'll change the server name. And so they end up with like 500 of the same scripts, and each one of them have a different server name and it's got a different script name. Well, then the problem is, whenever you find that you have a problem, you need to update those scripts. Well, you've created this massive technical debt for yourself. And generally you find this with point and click admins. That point and click admins are used to pointing and clicking in the GUI all day long and repeating themselves. When they move to PowerShell, they bring that same mentality with them, and they're repeating themselves in PowerShell all day long. Well, don't repeat yourself, whether it's in PowerShell or it's in the GUI. So you'll notice that we're going to parameterize this for a computer name instead of hard coding a computer. So we'll run this, and we can actually provide two computer names, and the only thing it did was output the computer names. But what I want you to see is that the computer names are parameterized. I could have queried the computers or whatever I wanted to do. Don't hard code values. That's the moral of the story. Okay, well, the problem here is I could actually run I could run this command with no input, and it would run without error. I could run it with one computer name, two computer names, or whatever. There's no validation with this first simple command here. So, and also try to create your parameters with standardized names. You want the same look and feel as the default built-in commandlets. So when you run invoke command, the parameter for the computer name, it's computer name. It's not server name, it's not host name, it's not computer. And I have a function here that's kind of a jumping ahead, but I'm doing this to prove a point. So what we're going to do, we're actually going to query all the commandlets on this machine, and we're going to find out how many have a parameter called computer name, computer, server name, host, and machine. So we'll run this line of code, and you'll notice that there are 0 that have computer, server name, host, or machine. There's actually 40 commandlets that have computer name, and these are just the ones that are currently loaded, so it's actually not every single command. But by far, computer name is the most used parameter name. So that's what I want to use on my custom functions. So when somebody who's used to the default PowerShell, when you hand them your custom module that has your custom functions and they start using your commands, they can almost guess what the parameter names are because you standardized yours with the default PowerShell commands. So now back to our test Mr. Parameter function. So this is the same command we had earlier. But what I want to show you is this is not an advanced function. So when I start calling this and I press that, see, I've got one parameter. It's computer name. That's it. I don't have verbose. I don't have all that stuff. Okay, so let's take a look at the syntax. There's multiple ways to see the different parameters. So if I look at the syntax here, you can see that computer name, and it wants an object. So, and then there's another way with get command to see all the parameters, and you can see the only parameter is computer name. There's another help topic. You can view that when you download the script. So commandlet binding, this part right here, is what turns a normal function into an advanced function. And it seems so simple, but it actually gives you a lot more functionality. So what we'll do here, we'll just we'll load this into memory, and now we'll see what you'll notice. Now I've got a whole list. I've got all the common parameters in addition to the computer name by simply adding commandlet binding. It enables all this other functionality. We'll run the same commands we ran before, so now you can see I've got computer name, I've got common parameters. When you look at it using this different method, you can see there's a whole list of them. So I've got verbose, debug, Erection, pipeline variable, and so on. So there's several more help topics there. I'd recommend taking a look at those. And one thing I'll tell you about the help topics, I'll just share this with you, that there's all the books in the world, and there's some great books out there, don't get me wrong, but usually books are just the Cliff Note version of the help topics, that everything you ever wanted to know about functions is right there in the help for you without having to spend a dime. And that's one of the things I like about PowerShell so much, is it's real easy to sell automation using PowerShell to management because it's free with every version of Windows. Okay, so support should process is something that a lot of people, they always put it in there. They don't know what it does. They think that's what turns something in, a function into an advanced function, but that couldn't be further from the truth. So the only thing we've added at this point is a support should process. We've loaded this function into memory. So now guess what that does? That gives us what if and confirm. And you don't need this in every function. Just think of it this way. You really need it if a function's going to make a change, and just because you add support should process doesn't mean that all the commands in there automatically support what if and confirm. Now if you're wrapping other commandlets in your function and they already support what if and confirm, then you're good to go. But if you've got some custom code in there, like if you're using the .NET framework to access a SQL Server or something like that, then those commands don't have what if and confirm support. Or if you're using like ADSI to access Active Directory, those don't automatically have what if and confirm support, and you'll need to write the logic to take advantage of that. But think of it this way. If you're writing a function and it could be a resume generating event, then you should add what if and confirm support to it. So also, let's take a look at the syntax. So now you can see I've got computer name, I've got what if, I've got confirm, and I've got the common parameters. And if I run the other command like I did before, then you can see what if and confirm are at the bottom there in addition to all these other parameters. So now parameter validation. And I've talked a little bit about parameter validation already. Now, one of the things that a lot of people, they don't really consider typing your variables or your parameters as validation, but it really is kind of a form of validation. And you'll notice here what I've done is I've actually typed computer name as a string. And I'll show you what that does. This is a good idea to always type your variables, because what it's going to do, now I can specify one computer name with this function with no problem at all. Well, when I try to give it two computer names, it says no, can't do that, because it can't convert value to type system.string. And basically we're trying to give it multiple values or an array or a collection, and it wants a single string. So, but the problem is I can still run this command without giving it any valid input, which could be bad depending on what the command does. So we may want to make the parameter mandatory. And you can see here, now this is actually the version 3 syntax. If you're using version 2, the syntax is a little bit different. And one of the things, I mean, nobody can remember all this stuff. How do you remember this when you sit down and you hadn't done this in a few weeks? Well, you can always open up a command window. You can hit Control-J for snippets. I like to use the complete advanced function. So if you put that in, then you'll actually get the all the syntax. So if we find one that's got mandatory, you'll see mandatory equal true. That's actually the version 2 syntax. So if you're using commands, if everything else in your function supports version 2, like if you're using get WMIObject, then I'd recommend using the version 2 syntax when you do the parameter declaration. I typically write to version 3 and higher. If you're using something like getSimInstance, which is only available in version 3, then you might as well just go ahead and use the version 3 syntax. So now I want you to see that if I don't give it a computer name, if I don't give it valid input, guess what it's going to do? It's going to say, no, you've got to give me a computer name. So I can give it whatever name I want, like server01, since this function really doesn't do anything. And this isn't about writing your code for you. It's about, I want you to learn how to think for yourself. I want you, when you're sitting down and you're writing your own code, I want you to think about this stuff. Okay, so what if I do want to support one or more computer names? Well, you would type your variable or your parameter as an array of strings. So you have these extra set of square brackets after string. And you'll see a lot of these things in the help topics as well, and that's why it's good to know that information, because it translates to different areas of PowerShell. Because a lot of people, they see this cryptic syntax and they see it in the help and they're like, I have no idea what that means. But if you'll learn it in one place, then it'll translate to different areas of PowerShell. So now if we run this, and when we run this without a value this time, notice it asks for computer name 0. So if we wanted to say, like, we have DC01 and we have SQL 03. And if you want, I don't have any help for this, but if you had help for the parameter, you could do the exclamation question mark and see it says no help is available for computer name. Well, if I just press enter now, it'll return those two values. And if I run that command again, and I just press enter, then it gives me an error because it says, it can't be an empty array, it's mandatory. Okay. So default values and mandatory parameters are mutually exclusive. And so you can access the environment variables on a computer using environment : and then whatever the name of the variable is. So I can get the computer name, which is PC01, on the computer I'm on. And that's the type of stuff you want to do. You don't want to use localhost. And you can also use dot. So if I put dot in here and pressed enter, it actually didn't work there, but usually you can use dot for the computer name. But if you have defined a mandatory parameter, you cannot specify a default value. You can specify it, but it'll never be used. And when you're writing your functions, something else, and I've got like over 400 blog articles now on my blog site. I blog every week, and I've been blogging since 2009. The PowerShell Script Analyzer, which is on GitHub, and it's published by the PowerShell team, you can actually run that against your code, and it'll tell you a lot of the best practices that you're not following. And there was actually, the reason I bring that up at this point is there was actually a problem with the Script Analyzer rule where they were wanting you to specify default values, and even when you had a mandatory parameter, which I logged a bug for that because it's not possible to do that. So anyway, when I run the function, see, it's not using the default value. And one thing you can't do, you can't use an environment variable at this point because it won't translate it. See, it actually gave me what I typed in. Okay, so what you want to do, if you do want to specify a default value, but you want the same feel as it being mandatory, what you want to do is use validate, not null, or empty instead of mandatory, and you'll see this. So that's the only change to this function from the previous one is that one line. Instead of mandatory, we're using validate, not null, or empty. So if I run the command this time, see, it defaults to PC01, which is the local computer name. But I can specify server 01 and 02, and it'll actually use those, and it won't use the default value. Okay, so the other thing you can use for validation, you can actually use enumerations. So what this enumeration is, it's the console colors. So I'll show you this. Let's clear a screen. So these are all the colors you can set for your console. And you'll notice, like, this is the color I like. I like the gray background for my console with the black writing. It's kind of inverted to what it is by default. It's easier to see for me. So anyway, if I wanted to somehow set that color, then I'd want to validate it. Well, they may change the colors possibly between versions of the operating system or PowerShell or whatever. So instead of statically putting these in, I may want to have it dynamically get them, and that's basically what I'm doing here. So if I run this and I run the command, then it's just going to return all of them. But maybe I want to specify blue and dark blue. So I can run that. Hey, those work fine. Well, if I specify pink with it, which is not a valid value, then guess what? It's going to give me an error. And that's actually going to fail at this point. It's not even going to get to the command where it's going to do anything. And that's the way you want this to work. You want it to fail early before any system changes are made. You want to validate your data in the parameter block. Okay, so if you want to find, one of the questions you may have is, I want to find what the valid system enumerations are. You know, how did you figure out what this is? Well, if you'll go and download this get type script, actually I think it's a function that's written by Warren Frame, who is also known as the Cookie Monster, then you can actually run this command here. It'll give you a list of all the types. So I'm going to run the command, and I'm getting this error because I actually haven't loaded that script. So that script is in my scripts module, or scripts directory. So it's called get type, and this will be something. So if I run this right here, if it's a function, and I try to run get type, let's see, yeah, it's get type, then it won't run because I didn't dot source the function. So what it did, it loaded this function, and let's just open it in the ISE here, because this is actually pretty important. This was kind of confusing when I started with PowerShell. So I've got this get type, and see, it's a function. So what happens is when you run this script that contains the function, and you really shouldn't store scripts or functions in scripts unless you're going to have a module that dot sources all those scripts, and that's okay. It's not how I write mine, but it's perfectly fine. So to load this into memory, what you need to do is put a dot and put a space and then the path. And if it was in a different directory, so it's actually loaded into memory now. So if I run this command, then it's going to return a lot of stuff. Well, let's just say I was in a different directory, like if I was at the root. You would actually specify c:/scripts /get type, and then you would put your dot and space. So it would look like this. This is still dot sourcing, and this you don't typically see people do this, but this would still do it. So it would actually dot source the script in a different folder. Okay, so now if I go back to where we were, and if I actually run this, these are all the system enumerations on this system. So that's how I can find the enumerations. So one of the enumerations in here is like the days a week, and I know there's another way to get the days a week, but maybe somebody's going to change the days of the week, and I want it to get them dynamically. So there I can run it and get it from an enumeration. Okay, well, now let's talk about type accelerators to validate code, because maybe you want to validate IPv4, IPv6 addresses. You could spend a lot of time writing tons of code, a lot of lines of code to validate IP addresses. And even if you use like a regular expression, that's still complexity that you don't have to write. So what you can do, all you have to do is use the IP address type accelerator, which is what I have highlighted. So I can actually, I can load this into memory, and then I can check to see, hey, is this a valid IP address? Yes, it is. It tells me, and it'll even tell me if it's a multicast address, if it's a link local, if it's a IPv4 mapped to IPv6 address, and it's not any of those. Well, then we all know that this is an invalid IP address because it's more than 255. So if I run this, guess what? It fails right there in the parameter block. Well, and I think we all know that IPv6 addresses are a lot more complicated. Just looking at them, I can't tell if one of those addresses is valid or not. So I can put in an IPv6 address, I can run it, and hey, it's valid. Well, guess what? I run this next one, that's now a valid IPv6 address. So I can validate IPv4 and IPv6 addresses with this one little piece of code. Okay, so and then again, maybe you want to know, okay, how do I figure out what the type accelerators are in PowerShell? So I can run this line of code. I'm actually going to sort them, so it'll be a little easier to see them. And these are the, so you can see the IP address one. So there's another one. So if we go up to the IP address one, so you can see there's a mail address. So you can probably validate, yeah, it's an email address. So you can validate an email address using a type accelerator without writing any code, no regular expressions, no nothing. If you have the PowerShell community extensions, you can even use this little shorter method to run that, but I don't have it on this machine, so yeah, it generates an error. Okay, so now that we've gotten through validating input, let's talk about verbose output. A lot of times you'll see people putting inline comments in their code, and if it's something that only a developer would ever need to know and it's something very obscure, then that's okay. But the problem is usually that comment is not going to be updated when the code is updated, and nobody's ever going to see it unless they're buried in that code. So let's go ahead and load this. So when I run this and I use verbose, guess what? It doesn't do anything. I don't see any of this. The only way I would ever see this is if I actually open the code up and look at it. So I prefer to use write verbose instead of inline comments. So the only thing I've done is I've actually changed that line, instead of using inline comments, to use write verbose. So we'll load the new function into memory. Now we'll run it without the verbose parameter, so we don't get any extra output. All we have to do is add the verbose parameter, and guess what? Now we get our comments. So let's talk a little bit about pipeline input. And actually, I think I'll stop. And do you guys have any questions at this point?
No, we don't have any questions. I think we're doing good.
Okay. So let's continue with pipeline input. So there's really two ways of accepting pipeline input. There's plan A, which is by value, and there's plan B, which is by property name. So plan A is always tried first if it's available, and plan B is only tried if plan A fails. Now sometimes by value is not wired up, it's not available. So it'll go immediately to by property name. And sometimes a parameter, of course, doesn't have pipeline input at all. Okay, so what we've done here is we've actually added this value from pipeline. We've also added a process block, because what happens is for each item that comes through the pipeline, this process block is going to execute one time. You can also have a begin block and an end block. The begin block will actually execute prior to any values coming through the pipeline, and it'll only run one time no matter how many values come through the pipeline. And the end block will run at the end, and it will only run one time. Generally, the begin block is to set stuff up, and then the process actually does your data, whatever you're doing to your data, and then the end block is for cleanup. But you don't have to have all the blocks. You can mismatch. But if you put if you're accepting pipeline input and you put any code outside of those blocks, then it'll generate an error. So if I run this, then it runs fine. So these two values are strings. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pipe two strings. So by value, you can see it's typed as a string. That's how it's going to know what to accept via pipeline by value. So you'll notice no errors. Okay, so now what we're going to do is create a custom object, and this one is actually going to be, I'll show you. It'll be easier to show you. So you can see we actually have a PS custom object, but it's it has two values, two computer names. So now we can pipe those objects into here. And this one, normally it'll generate an error. Now, different versions of PowerShell, I've seen this act a little bit differently, but normally it would generate an error, but we can see it's definitely not the output that we expected. So we can switch over and use by property name. So we changed it from by value to by property name. So we'll load this function into memory. Now we'll try to pipe our strings into that function. Well, guess what? We get an error because it's wanting something that has a computer name. So now we do have this object that is computer names. So we'll pipe that into this function, and you'll notice that it worked without issue. Now, it's also very common. A lot of people will ask, well, why are you accepting by value, which is this one, and by property name? Because this one is going to be by type, and the type is string, and this one's going to be by property name, and the property name is computer name. Now, a lot of times if you have one function or commandlet that produces a certain name, and you don't want to use a non-standard name for your function, you can set parameter aliases, and that will allow you, whatever alias you use, like host name, you could actually accept pipeline input by property name by those alias names. So we'll load this into memory. So now we can actually pipe our strings into our function, but we can also pipe our object into it. So both of them work now. Okay. So let's see what we're doing here. So what I've done here is I've got a begin block and only a begin block. And what's going to happen here, it's going to output test, but no computer name, because this computer name does not exist in the begin block. And this is a problem. I've run into this and troubleshot this. You wouldn't believe how long to figure this out. So it's kind of a pitfall, but when we pipe this in, you'll notice that we got test one time. Okay, and you'll notice we also got test again. So that's because if I took and put this in a process block, and ran this again, then it would actually output it for each one. Oh, and this one here is a little bit odd, but it's because I don't have a for each in there. So let's put it back on begin, because I'm going to save this script when we're done. Also want you to notice I was talking about formatting for readability. Notice how this starts here and this ends here. So I know that this is the end of the function. The begin block begins here, it ends here. Everything is indented, so it's very readable. And this readability is not that big a deal in a dozen lines, but if you have 500 lines, it's a really big deal. If you're missing a curly brace somewhere, it helps a lot.
Mike?
Yes.
Could you please explain the difference between the begin block and the process block?
Sure. So let's do this. So normally, if you're writing, you would have process, you would have end. Okay, so the begin block actually, let's put this in here. So this executes one time, and it executes prior to the pipeline input. So that executes one time prior to the pipeline input. This executes one time for each item sent through pipeline input. And then this executes one time after the process block, normally used for cleanup. And what you would have to do normally, because if you use parameter input, you would normally see a for each item, and well, actually it's for each computer in computer name. So you would normally run it this way, and this would only be used if you were inputting via parameter input. It's actually used both ways, but what's going to occur if you piped in two computer names, this is going to run once for the first computer, so for each item is only going to be for each one in the first computer name. And when it runs again via pipeline input, it's going to run this, and it's going to run once for the second computer. But if it comes in parameter input, it's actually only going to run the process block one time, but it's going to run this twice. And really, the best way to is to write a real simple function and to kind of play or test this to understand how it works. That's one thing that I tell people is complexity is not required to understand this. It actually hinders your learning if you have a really complicated function. Write something very basic so that, and I'll actually do this. Let's do this. So let's do write output begin block. Write output Okay, so what we're going to do here, and normally I would put the comments on top of the code, but for the purposes of this, it won't matter. So we're actually going to load this into memory. When I execute, I'm only going to execute it with one thing to start with. So when I execute that, you'll notice it executed begin once, process once, and end once. But when I run it twice, it's going to run begin once, process twice, and end once. And this object has two items in it, so if I run it, it actually does the same thing. Now let me show you what happens if I get rid of the for each. I'll comment it out. I want to load this into memory. So if I run this command again, and let's clear what our output. So it appears there's no difference. And actually there's no difference because on pipeline input, for all intents and purposes, the for each is never used. Now if you took this command, excuse me. If you took this command and you ran it with parameter input, notice that it only ran the process block one time. It ran it twice, but it only outputted it for PC01. And you can see that if I let's do this. So if I uncomment the for each and load this into memory, and run this command again that's parameterized, you'll notice it ran it twice. And that's where the for each comes into play. So does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay. So error handling. Error handling.
We have a question.
Sure.
What happens if you run it using a pipeline and the for each loop? Will it process 4 times?
So the question is, what happens if you run it with the pipeline as well as for each? Would it print it four times?
Are you talking about, like, if I run just this?
That's
Like
right.
that? So no, it actually, the reason it doesn't run it 4 times in that scenario is because, let me make this a little clearer. Let me put this, and of course, when you use single quotes, everybody should know this, you don't get a variable expansion. So you get the literal, so I actually have to change it to double quotes. So let's actually output process block and the computer name. So process block and then the computer name. And that'll make it a little bit clearer, I think. So let's load that new version into memory. So now when we run it, when we pipe the values in, notice DC01 came through first and then PC01. So when I run the second command, it's actually going to do the same thing. And the reason is that when you do pipeline input, only one item goes through here at a time. So when one item goes through and it runs it through the for each, there's only one item going through. There's only one item in computer name at that point. And when it runs it again, it has the second computer name. So the for each really doesn't do anything when it comes through as a pipeline input, because there's only one value coming through at a time. Where if it comes through as parameter input, it actually, for all intents and purposes, it doesn't even use the process block. It actually just runs it through the for each. So I know that's actually very confusing. But it's something that once you start writing these, and you'll see how it works. Because if you take the for each out, the easiest way to do it is if you ever leave out the for each, your command won't work properly. So you'll run the first command, and you'll say, yes, I've got this command that works great with pipeline input, and you'll hand it off to somebody else, and they'll use parameter input. Well, guess what? No, it didn't work properly. And actually, the reason I killed the computer name is because computer no longer exist, and it would have to be computer name. So let's load it into memory again. So notice that DC01 and PC01 both came through, no problems at all. You run it with parameter input, you actually get them, and that time it got them both at the same time, because yes, for computer name, it actually has them both in there at that point. So, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about error handling. We won't spend too much time on this. It can be confusing, but once you figure it out, it's fairly cut and dry. Try catch only catches terminating errors. That's kind of what usually everybody's problem is, because they're trying to handle non-terminating errors with try catch. And it's actually try catch finally. And believe it or not, you don't even have to have a catch. You have to have either catch or finally. So you can have try finally or try catch, and you can have all three, try catch finally. But normally finally is not used that much, because finally will execute whether a terminating error occurs or not, and it's normally for cleanup as well. So what I'll do is load this into memory. I don't have try catch in here at all. So this command, it runs fine. I'm running test WSMan. I'm testing for PowerShell remoting on DC01 to make sure I can connect to it. And test WSMan is what you really should be using on newer desktops or servers, really servers, because a lot of people will use test. I think it's test connection, or I don't even use that command very much, but let's see what it is. Yeah, test connection, but all that does is a ping, and probably everybody already knows that with Windows 7 and Server 2008 or 2008 R2 and higher, that the firewall blocks pings by default. So you can run test connection all day long and it's going to say, yeah, the computer doesn't exist. But if you run test WSMan, it's going to check for PowerShell remoting. Okay, so if I run this and I use a computer that does not exist, what's going to happen is, and it may take a second here, it actually generated for the first one that does not exist, it generated a unhandled exception. So what we'll do this time, we'll actually take our test WSMan and we'll wrap it inside the try block, and then so we've added try catch to this. And we're going to write a warning out instead of generating an unhandled exception. Except this is actually not going to work, and I'm simulating the problem that most people have with try catch. So they run this, and then they run the command, and guess what? They get an unhandled exception, and they don't understand why. Well, the reason is that the command WSMan and many commands don't generate terminating errors by default. So you have to add Erection stop to the command to turn a non-terminating error into a terminating error. Now, there's also an Erection preference variable. So if I took this and I ran this, let's just run it over here. So you can see the default is continue. Well, this is for the entire shell, that a lot of people will change this to stop. And if you're working with something like the .NET framework, you don't have a commandlet that has the Erection preference per command, then that's the only way you can do this, and that's fine. Change it, and then run your command, and then change it back. And what I would recommend, instead of just blindly changing it and changing it back, is check and see what it is before you start, and then change it, and then set it back to whatever it was before you started. Don't just assume it's on continue, because you may be on a machine where it's not continue. Okay, so let's go ahead and load this command with the Erection stop into memory. We'll run the command again. So when you hand this off to somebody and they run this, see, that's, to me, it's much more graceful to get a warning saying it's unable to connect to this computer. And maybe you want to output that to a text file instead of showing it on the screen, because maybe you're running some process against 500 machines and you want to know it failed on these 20, because maybe you want to go back later and try those again. So, and that's all I'm going to cover with try catch. It's the other thing I will tell you with try catch is don't wrap your entire 500 lines worth of code inside one try catch block. Try to put your try catches on individual or maybe a couple of commands, and try to target your try catch for where you think problems would occur. You can actually have more than one catch block for a single try block, and you can actually catch exceptions. So you can handle different exceptions different ways. And if you take a look at the help topic, then there are some examples of that. So comment-based help, and this is not the last thing on here, and it's certainly not least, is people, generally somebody who has worked with PowerShell for more than 5 minutes, they've run get help on get service or get process or something like that, so they at least know how to get help. Well, you want your commands that you write to look and feel just like the default commands. So when I have this command, get Mr. Auto Stop Service, and somebody gets a hold of this and they have no idea what it does, then they can actually run the help for it. And I'm going to change this to show window. So that's kind of the one I've gotten where I like to run. So you'll notice that this tells me, it gives me a synopsis, it gives me a description, it tells me the input, it tells me the output, it even gives me some notes about who wrote this. It shows me some examples. So I can get the same look and feel as the default commandlets. And you'll hear me say that over and over because that's really what you're shooting for with your commands. So I've already showed you the snippets, because one of the snippets that I'll use is this is actually the help. And the snippets, I actually don't put my help outside the function, I put it inside the function. The other thing is, notice that synopsis should be all in uppercase because all the other keywords in uppercase. And that's one of those things, you know, where standardization, keep it all standardized. And that's one of the reasons I like automation, because when I use automation, let's say I'm creating Active Directory users or something like that, I don't have to worry about somebody one day creating it a user in proper case and the next day somebody's going to create it in all uppercase. Then when they put it in, and no matter what they put it in the commands I write, it's going to convert it to the case I want it in, and it's going to create it that way so every one is exactly the same. So, and for additional resources, I've got a lot more help topics here. There's a community book of PowerShell best practices. There's also a PowerShell practice and style guide on GitHub. I've got a walkthrough on how I write PowerShell functions. I've got a couple more things to show you. We don't need that. We don't need this. So let's see. Okay, so maybe I'm writing a couple of functions. I'm going to keep these real simple. So I've written a couple of functions here. One's going to get the PowerShell version that you've already seen. One, we're going to get the operating system version. So I've kind of already shown you how to dot source these, but let's just call this my functions. So I save that to a PS1 file. I'll just change into the scripts folder to be a little bit easier. So I'll dot source that. So now I can run get PS version, or it's get Mr. PS version. It's like I turned my caps lock on. So I can run that command. I can also run get OS version. Get the OS version. Well, the problem is when I close out my PowerShell session and reopen it, it's going to delete those commands. And that's not really an optimal experience, especially for handing this off to a junior level admin. So I'll just go ahead and, this is get child item, but I'll use the dir alias function get Mr. Star. So I can see those two commands there. Let's go ahead and get rid of them. Okay, so we got rid of those two commands. So what you really want to do, you want to put this into a script module. So what we're going to do, we're going to save this. We're going to go up to my documents. We're going to go to Windows PowerShell modules. This is not a folder that necessarily exists. So I'll show it to you again. Now, so there's two places. This is per user. So it goes in your documents folder. It goes under Windows PowerShell. You have to create that folder if it doesn't already exist. And then in modules, the other place is in C, program files, Windows PowerShell, I think is where it is. Yeah, Windows PowerShell modules. So this is where this would be all users. But typically, if I have something that I'm working on that I've created, then I'll put it in my user module path. You'll want to create a folder with the same name as the my functions. So what I'm going to do now is save this as a PSM1 file. And the other thing you want to do, so let's actually run get module name my functions, and it's not loaded, so we'll do we'll do list available. So you can see that I actually have a script module. It's got 2 commands in there, but it says version 0.0. And if I actually pipe this to format list star, you'll see there's really not a lot of data in here about this module. Okay, so one thing you always want to do when you're creating a module is create a module manifest and upload it to a NuGet repository. With PowerShell get, you actually have to have a module manifest. So I want to paste some code in here, and what this does, it's new module manifest. I got the path in here to the PSD1 file. You want to give it an author and a description, and then the module root. I used to not give them descriptions, but if you don't give it a description, you can't upload it to a NuGet repository. So I'll create that file, and I'll show you that file. It's module manifest is metadata about your PowerShell module. So we'll go ahead and open that up. So now we have that file opened, and you'll notice it's got my author in there, it's got a copyright it puts in by default, it's got my description, and so on. But it also has the version, so you can increment this version as you're making changes. So now if I go back and I run this command, you'll notice now our module is at version 1.0. And then also if I run it to, I'll put that to format list star, you'll notice it's got my copyright, it's got my author, it's got all the metadata about this module. So the really cool thing is, I want you to notice if I run this, see those functions that I was using before do not exist. Well, guess what? Since it's a script module and it's in my it's actually an environment variable, PS module path, and that's kind of hard to read, so what we'll do, we'll actually take and split that, and we'll split it on a semicolon. And so now you can see what's in my path. There's a couple in there that's been added because like I have the SQL module installed, but it's in this location. So with PowerShell version 3 and higher, like I was talking earlier, we have autoloading. So only thing I have to do is just call it. If I just say get Mr. OS and I can hit tab, well guess what? It just loaded the module. I can run the command. I can run the command for the other one to get the PowerShell version. So that's kind of the power of script modules, at least. And as you can see, it wasn't very difficult to take our functions and turn them into a script module. So you can take all those tools that are similar and you can group it into your own toolkit, and then you can put that on a NuGet repository and share it with your coworkers. And it's really an easy way to do things. And you can write, as far as writing functions, I'll show you another function here. I actually think I may have this one saved. Yeah. So let's just say I didn't have the Active Directory module on this machine. So I've got get Mr. AD user. So I've written this one here that kind of mimics the default output to get AD user. But what I'm doing is I'm actually using ADSI. So we'll load that into memory. We'll run get Mr. AD user. We'll give it a username of Mike. Guess what? There's Mike. So that looks just like the default output of get AD user. So like when Windows 10 came out and you didn't have the RSAT tools for it, you can actually just write your own command and you don't even need that. I have another one that And this one's got the help and everything where that one didn't. So so this one here is called Invoke Mr. SQL Data Reader. So if I run this, I can actually invoke Mr. SQL Data Reader server instance SQL 03. And remember, SQL 03 does not have PowerShell on it. So database master query, let's say select star from sys. Well, actually, we don't need to select star. Let's just say select name from sys.databases. Guess what? Hey, we don't need PowerShell on the remote machine. This command, the way I wrote it, it actually uses SQL management objects. Let's see. Yeah. No, actually, this one uses the .NET framework. So you don't even need the SQL tools to query a SQL database. And if I didn't know how to use this command, I could just say help invoke Mr. SQL Data Reader. And let's take a look at the examples. So I can specify a credential with it if I need to. Well, the really cool thing is I can actually pipe the input to this command. I can take this command and our server name is actually SQL 03. So I can actually pipe a SQL query. So if I had another command that actually created a query for me, I could pipe it into this command. And there I can see my database IDs, the compatibility levels, and the recovery modes of the databases. There's a pub database on that machine. And that's all without having PowerShell on the remote server. Okay. Do we have any questions?
No questions in the room.
And with these functions, you know, you can get advanced as you want to. Like this function here, what it does, a lot of people think that getting the services that are set to automatic that are not running is real easy, but actually it's really difficult. And the reason it's difficult is you have these delayed auto start services, and they actually return as an auto start service. And the only way to get that data is actually query the registry on the remote machine if you're querying remote machines to get the data. So what this is going to do, this is actually going to go, it's going to use invoke send method, and I'm going to query the registry remotely with invoke send method. So it looks like the way this command is written, I haven't tried this on the SQL 03 server without PowerShell, but let's just find out what happens. I think I wrote this so it would work. Yeah, you'll see it actually, I queried all these machines, and there's a service on SQL 03 that's not running that should be running. And so this command's written in such a way, it actually creates a sim session. So it queries it actually runs test WSMan that I showed earlier, and if it returns a stack version of version 3 or higher, and it uses a regular expression for that, then it'll actually use WSMan. Otherwise, it'll create a sim session using it uses the sim commandlets. It'll create a sim session with the DCOM protocol to those machines. So then I have
how would you be able to use similar code for those services that are triggered?
Yes, the way that you actually, somebody had that question because I have this on the TechNet script repository, and it's another key. Let's see. It's actually another key in the registry that you have to check. And I actually have a Hey Scripting Guy blog article that I wrote on this, and it tells you what all these values are. Because that's also one of the things that I'm big into is some of this stuff, like I can't tell you what 2 means right now. I can't tell you what this 1 means either. So I like to figure things out, and I may not use this for a while, but I'll write myself a tool, and I'll also write a blog article about how I did this, so that I only have to figure it out one time. I write a tool to do that task for me, and then I'll go to that tool whenever I need to accomplish that task. And then if I can't remember why I did that, I have a blog article to go to that is at least indexed on my blog so I can search and find it. But yes, the answer to your question is you can also get the triggered services with this. In addition, getting the services is okay, you know, but what we want to do, we actually want to start the services. So I actually have this script. I have a list of server names that this script runs like every morning before I even get to work. If there's a service that's set to automatic that should be running that's not delayed auto start, it actually starts the service and it sends me an email telling me that it started the service, so I know that there was a problem. So if I run this, and I'm actually going to say no, I actually have it running the command at the bottom, which is, if you're going to save this, don't do this. Don't run the commands at the bottom. But you can see I have what if and confirm because I just want to say, hey, the remote registry is not running on that machine, but it's just going to tell me what it would do. It would start it. I can also say confirm, so I get the prompt to say yes, no, or whatever. Let's go ahead and say yes. Well, then if I go back and I have the command in here so it'll be easier to run. So if I run this against DC01, my guess is it won't return anything now because I just stopped the only one that had an issue. And all this code, all these different functions, I'll wrap all these up in the zip file and post them as well. The only one I haven't posted in a blog article is the Skip Mr. AD User. It's something I actually wrote for another blog article I'm working on because with ADSI, a lot of this stuff is case sensitive. Like, let me show you the get. So if I do get Mr. AD User and I say Mike, then it returns like surname. But if I take and change this properties to lowercase p, I think I'm actually going to break it. So let's run that, and let's run our command again. No, it did work. Oh, maybe it's this part. Some of these are case sensitive because I had trouble with these. Yeah, notice now I don't have a surname because I changed this S to uppercase. So a lot of things in ADSI are case sensitive. And I've been like searching PowerShell. I wrote some blog articles on unexpected case sensitivity in PowerShell. And this is not per se PowerShell because I'm using a different technology. I'm using PowerShell to access ADSI, similar to WMI or SQL management objects or so on. And that's one of the really cool things I like about PowerShell is I can use PowerShell. I'm kind of a jack of all trades as far as infrastructure guy, so I can use PowerShell and I can manage all those different products. And like, let's say a product like we used to use Backup at Zach, and like I said, we're a big Dell shop, so now we use Aperture. But anyway, Backup at Zach, I've been using that product since like the Seagate days, and like Seagate owned it, Veritas, Symantec, and so on. And the GUI's changed so many times over the years that I don't even recognize the product now to what it used to be. So every time they release a new version, I got to learn where to point and click. Well, now with the 2012 version, they added PowerShell support. So I don't care what they do to the GUI now. They can do whatever they want. I'll just open up PowerShell and manage it.
Mike, the reason it's case sensitive is because it came from original Unix.
Ah, that makes sense. I did not know that. I'll have to make a note of that.
I believe it was the X500 directory specification.
Let's see. I have a few more slides. I think I'll jump into those if we don't have any more questions. Okay, so some additional resources. There's a free ebook on PowerShell Advanced Functions that I think it was 6 different PowerShell MVPs wrote, and I wrote one of the articles. I wrote the one on parameter validation, believe it or not. Jeff Hicks and June Blender and Bo Proc, several other people wrote articles on that as well. And all these are links, as you can see, so if you get the slide deck, then you can go to these. Blogs are a great place to find additional information. What I would recommend, my blog is micahfrobbins.com, and like that's difficult to remember, so I have an alias for my blog. So like I said, all my commands are Mr. something. Well, if you go to mrpowershell.com, that'll actually redirect you to my blog. And I have a blog roll on there, and those are really the go-to people they have great articles and code and all that sort of stuff, and they blog regularly, because I actually update that all the time, and if somebody hasn't blogged in like 6 months, or if they're writing garbage, then I'll drop them off of there. And then if I find somebody who's writing great code and blogging all the time, then I'll add them to it. User groups, I mean, you're at a user group tonight, so it's a great place. The Mississippi PowerShell user group, we meet virtually every month, and we actually we don't have a physical location. We just meet online. We record our meetings sometimes if we have a speaker. Like this month, we're just going to have a Q&A session. Hey, bring your questions. We'll open up PowerShell and we'll dive into it. So it's on what used to be Patch Tuesday, which is the second Tuesday of the month at 8:30 p.m. Central Time. We meet for about an hour and a half, and it's with a link. So if you go to an alias for that user group website is MS PowerShell. So MS is the abbreviation for Mississippi. mspowershell.com. PowerShell.org is a great resource. Probably everybody knows that already. They have great forums. So if you have any questions that you think about after this, feel free to contact me. But PowerShell.org is really a good place for questions, because usually you'll get different perspectives from different people. You get more than one answer. PowerShell Magazine is another great resource. PowerShellMagazine.com. It's a free online magazine. The Hey Scripting Guy blog, I can't tell you how many times that I'm searching for something on Bing or Google or whatever I'm using, and it'll come up with a Hey Scripting Guy blog article, and I've written a number of blog articles for him as well. The Microsoft Virtual Academy, some great videos out there. They're free. Everything on this slide so far, except for the last entry, which is Pluralsight, and that is a paid subscription. But they have some good videos that, to me, it's worth it. Okay, and this is the final slide. This is my contact info. So you go to my blog at micahfrobbins.com or mrpowershell.com. Those are pictures of the 2 books. I've co-authored one and written a chapter in the other one. You find me on Twitter. I'm a big believer in personal branding, so you can go to my blog on the About page and get my email address, or you can send me an email just about anywhere at micahfrobbins@whatever.com, and you'll probably find me, because I sign up for things even if I don't use them, just to get my brand. I'm on LinkedIn, and there's the user group information. And that's it. Do we have any final questions?
Nope. No question in the room. But yeah, it was very, very informative. So thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks a lot.